Shabbat Shalom, and welcome everyone. Today we have a message for you from Yeshua Messiah to help us all to understand how to keep the Sabbath. There's a lot of argument about the Sabbath. There are different groups that keep the Sabbath different ways. And even in ancient times, there were arguments about the Sabbath. Among all sorts of Jewish people, there are different ideas about the Sabbath. Among Messianic people, Christian people. And so today we want to talk about how you keep the Sabbath. Now, just to give you an example of what we're dealing with here, we have the Sabbath law in the book of Exodus. Let me read it to you. Exodus 31:12 through 17. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak also to the sons of Israel, saying, Most certainly you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work therein, that soul should be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." Well, the controversy in the Jewish world over how you keep the Sabbath all relates to the word here, work. Because anyone who works on the Sabbath will be cut off from his people. What is work? Well, the ancient Pharisaical authorities argued over this in great detail. And they concluded that since these verses tie work to the creation, to Yahweh's creation of the world, that work must relate then to creative activity. And further, they specified 39 creative activities, really 39 different groups of activities, which they then subcategorized with many detailed activities beyond that. And all of this is contained in the Mishnah. So for them, if you disobeyed any of those laws regarding the 39 creative activities, then you were breaking the Sabbath because you were working on the Sabbath. And this general idea continues in Orthodox Judaism today, but it originated among the Pharisees. What happened next is that once this was decided, this was bound upon Jewish people. Now, this comes under the category of binding and loosing. And the Pharisees had the authority, or claimed the authority, of binding and loosing. The Jewish Encyclopedia explains more to us about binding and loosing. It says, binding and loosing, rabbinical term for forbidding and permitting. The power of binding and loosing was always claimed by the Pharisees. Under Queen Alexandra, the Pharisees, says Josephus, quote, became the administrators of all public affairs so as to be empowered to banish and readmit whom they pleased, as well as to loose and to bind. End of the quote from Josephus, but continuing now the quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. This does not mean that, as the learned men, they merely decided what, according to the law, was forbidden or allowed, but that they possessed and exercised the power of tying or untying a thing by the spell of their divine authority. In other words, once they said it, it magically became true. The very fact that they said it made it true. We have to understand this aspect of the Sabbath and what Yeshua Messiah was actually dealing with to understand how he treated the Sabbath. And we're going to look today at a very, very interesting case of how he dealt with the Sabbath, which is actually meant to be an instruction, not only to the Pharisees of his day, but even to us as to how the Sabbath should actually be kept. Here in John, Yohanan, chapter 5, it says this. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Because of the chronology of the gospel story here, it's generally believed that this particular feast was the Passover feast. 3 times a year, all the men were commanded to go up to Jerusalem. And Yeshua went up to Jerusalem because he always obeyed the Torah. So that's why he was there. Verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. Well, this is interesting. It helps to fill out the story for us. He's in Jerusalem before the Passover. He is in a place by the sheep gate. Now, what is going on there? Probably sheep are being bought and sold at the sheep gate. People getting ready for the Passover are going and looking for their Passover lamb there at the sheep gate. And near this place is a pool. And the pool is called Bethesda, meaning house of mercy. You see, there's a subtext here of grace, a subtext of mercy. The Passover lamb was Yahweh's mercy for the firstborn of Israel. The pool is the house of mercy. Even the 5 porches or porticos represent the grace and mercy of Yahweh, because so many times in Scripture, when we have 5, it's connected with grace. Let's go on. It says, in these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. Well, I'm reading from the New American Standard, and I am using Yeshua's Hebrew name rather than the Greek name that is in this translation. But otherwise, I'm reading this translation. And what it says is that this angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons. Other translations are similarly nondescript. However, when you look more closely at the word seasons in the Greek, you'll find the word corresponds exactly with the Hebrew word moedim, or appointments. These are the feasts of Yahweh, the 7 feasts of Yahweh that occur each year, and particularly the 3 feasts each year that the men of Israel were required to attend. So what it's actually telling us here is that specifically for these appointments, Yahweh sent an angel to actually stir up the water in this pool so that whoever was the first to go in would be healed. And this must have been an amazing thing that this happened, because this was, again, just a gift of grace from Yahweh. There's nothing in the Tanakh explaining this to us. Yahweh never committed himself to do that. He just did it out of favor and grace for his afflicted people. And as this happened on these various appointments, they began to notice it. So that at the appointments, there were a large number of afflicted people that would be waiting in these 5 porches, all waiting for that water to stir, to try to get in, to try to be the first one in the water so that they could get their healing. Well, it goes on and it says, a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Yeshua saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, do you wish to get well? "38 years this man had been waiting to be healed. Now, certain faith healers today would say, that man must not have had enough faith. Because if he did, and he asked God, he would be healed. Yeshua didn't say that. Sometimes we have to wait for Yahweh's time for the things that we need. And this man had very patiently been waiting. 38 years he had been waiting. He didn't know exactly what he was waiting for, because he didn't know how he was ever going to get in that pool. What he was waiting for is the Messiah of Israel. He notices the afflicted when they have no friend. He is their friend. He's my friend. He was there for me in times when I've been afflicted. And I know if you know him, he's been there for you when you have been afflicted. But did you notice his question? Very strange question. Maybe he's asking you this question today. Do you wish to get well? Now, a lot of people would look at that question and think, that's a stupid question. Here's a man who had been waiting for 38 years to get well, and the first thing the Messiah of Israel says to him is, do you wish to get well? But it's not a stupid question. There are implications to getting well. If you get well, people expect things of you. Certain mercies that you may have received from the system around you aren't going to be there anymore if you get well. Maybe you're dependent on those things now. Maybe psychologically you have adjusted to ways of dealing with your affliction. And your life is going to totally change if you get well. Not everybody who's afflicted really wants to get well. And so it's not a foolish question at all to say, do you wish to get well? There's another reason, too, why he might have said that. It might have been, well, you've been waiting for 38 years. Why haven't you gotten in the water? I think that's how the man took it when we look at this man's answer. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me. He could never make it into the pool because he was more afflicted than all the others. So they always got there first. And he had no one to help him. This is a hard reality of this world, but so often those who are afflicted have no one. People are too busy to help afflicted people. And mostly they're in the way. That's how many people see it. And so they can't be bothered. So many times the friends that the able-bodied have, if something happens in their life and they become afflicted, all their friends soon disappear. Nobody had time to sit around that pool with this man, just waiting for an angel to stir the water. So he was on his own. A man without a friend. Yeshua said to him, Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk. Now, shouldn't there be something in between there? Shouldn't he be explaining to this man something about faith? Shouldn't he be telling him something about what was going to happen next so this man would understand? He didn't do any of that. He just told him what he needed to do because the time had come. The Messiah of Israel was standing right in front of him and commanded him to get up. But not just to get up, but to pick up his bed and walk. Now, imagine someone who is so afflicted he couldn't even walk, not only getting up, but getting up and picking up his bed and walking, carrying it around. How do you do that? Why would that man even think he could? Why at that point would he even think that he could get up, pick up his bed, and walk? Why didn't he say, "You're crazy. Didn't I tell you I've been afflicted for 38 years? I can't get up and walk." You know, that's what most people say to Yeshua. He says, "Get up and walk." And they say, "No, I can't get up and walk." This man did have faith. When he heard the authority in the voice of the Messiah of Israel, it says, immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Just like that. This is a kind of loosing. This man was bound by his affliction. And he was loosed from his affliction that day by the commanding authority of Yeshua Messiah. And he did exactly what Yeshua said, because he didn't just get up. He got up, became well, and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Works went along with his faith. Now it says, now it was the Sabbath on that day. Herein is the crux of the story. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." Well, why were they saying that to him? It's because he was obeying Yeshua Messiah. Because he was told to pick up his bed and walk, and he was walking all over Jerusalem with his bed. And so it prompted them on the Sabbath to correct him and say that he was wrong, because I'm sure if you looked up the 39 different areas of work that you cannot do in the Sabbath, picking up your bed and publicly walking around is on the list. You know, it's interesting. I looked up the the Greek word here for walk in Yeshua's command. And it's very interesting what this Greek word actually means. It says, to tread all around. That is, walk at large, especially as proof of ability. That's the actual definition from the Greek dictionary. So, Yeshua didn't tell the man, okay, get up, pick up your bed, and take it over to the corner. He said, get up, pick up your bed, and walk everywhere so everybody can see you. You suppose that man might have walked more than a Sabbath day's journey that day? It's no wonder that the people saw him. It's no wonder they took notice of him. This man carrying his bed all over Jerusalem on the Sabbath. They were horrified. This is what he said to them. He who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. Now, do you see his logic? If this man could tell me to pick up my bed and walk, and I stood up and picked up my bed and I was well, then I'm going to walk. I'm going to do what he tells me. Maybe he was worried if he didn't, he would end up in the same condition again. And maybe he would have. So they asked him, who is the man who said to you, pick up your pallet and walk? Now, right here is where all the bleeps and whistles should come in. Nobody said to him, wow, how is it that you could be afflicted for 38 years, and now today someone spoke to you and said to get up and walk? What is Yahweh doing in Israel? Nobody said that. Instead, they looked at him with a religious scowl, and they wanted to know who the culprit was that was telling him to break their religious Sabbath. That's what they wanted. They wanted to know that man. If it was me, I'd like to think in that moment the afflicted people that I know would be going through my mind. And I would think, wow, if someone has this power from God to heal like this, I want to know who he is so that I can tell my friend, my relative, my neighbor to get this touch and to be healed. Doesn't it make you wonder how their hearts got so hard? In a word, religion. Religion. Their hearts were hardened by religion so that they could not see the work of the Almighty. Well, here's what happened next. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Yeshua had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Yeshua knew ahead of time how the people would react, right? So when they started looking for him, he wasn't there. I think we all can learn something from that. We don't have to hang around for people to castigate us, to possibly even hurt us. We can use wisdom like Yeshua did and simply not be there. And some occasions allow for that. In this case, Yeshua knew it was not his time. He wasn't there. Well, what happened next? Said afterward, Yeshua found him in the temple and said to him, behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. The actual implication of the verse is the man had sinned, and that's what caused his illness. That's the implication of the verse. Now, that doesn't mean that's always what happens when someone has gotten sick or is afflicted, but that's what happened to this man. Maybe that's why he had no friends. Maybe they all knew that he had committed some sin, and because he did, They say, well, it's his own fault. And they just left him to struggle with his disease. But Yeshua told him simply, don't sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. He wasn't scolding the man. He was giving the man a warning, a friendly warning, so that nothing worse would happen to him. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Yeshua who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Yeshua because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, there's two things I'd like to talk about here. One is to continue our story of what happened next. But the other thing I'd like to talk about is who are Jews. Because as we read this story in John, when you read the word Jews here, they certainly are not put in a good light, are they? And so some people say, well, the Gospels are anti-Semitic and against the Jews. That would be a grave mistake to think that. What you need to realize about the book of John or Yohanan is it was written by a Jew. And it was written about a Jew. That Jew being Yeshua Messiah. And it was written late in the first century. Sometime after the year 90. Things had changed a lot by that time. And there were many Gentile believers at that time. A lot of water had gone under the bridge, you might say, between those who were followers of Yeshua and those who were not. And so all of that is part of the way John is speaking here, because he is speaking to the believers in general, including the Gentile believers. And the use of the word Jew had undergone a certain transformation so far as the believers were concerned. Now, I can demonstrate this for you somewhat in the book of Acts. And let me just read this one occurrence. In Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 4, and it talks about something that happened with Paul. In Iconium, they entered the synagogue of the Jews together and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and of Greeks. So at the synagogue in Iconium, which is a Greek city, Paul went in. This was his custom. And it says there, it was a synagogue of the Jews. So this is people who religiously are Jews. Some of these people might be converted Gentiles. But that's who Paul is actually talking about. And notice what it says, that some of these Jews became believers. That's important for us to realize. Some Jews were believers. Now then it goes on and it says this. But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. Therefore, they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who is testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. So you see, when we first came on the word Jews, it mentioned people who were of the Jewish religion. And then some of those believed. And now they were believing Jews. And then we have unbelieving Jews that stirred up trouble against Paul. And then finally, we have the Jews. It just says the Jews. Well, is that referring to both the unbelieving and the believing Jews, the ones that had believed? Jews? Well, it's used here to identify the unbelieving Jews. In other words, the ones that did not receive Yeshua Messiah. So this is what came to be the manner of speaking regarding the Jews. And the reason is because throughout the first century, there was a separating work going on among the Jews. And some became believers and some did not. So by the time that John wrote his gospel, for the most part, when he's talking about the Jews, what he means is the unbelieving Jews. Not all the Jews. Because he himself was a Jew. Messiah was a Jew. Many of the Jewish people followed Yeshua Messiah. So he's not talking about those people. So therefore, it's not anti-Semitic. At the very worst, what it is factional. But there were many factions among the Jews. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. So it's not about race. It's not about anti-Semitism. It's about what we would call today religious issues among the Jews. Now, if we understand that, then what we realize here is that in this particular case, this is really a controversy between Yeshua Messiah and the leaders of the Jewish religion, specifically the Pharisees. That's what this is about. That's what we have to understand when we get to this part of the story. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Yeshua who had made him well. Well, that statement is tantamount to saying he told the Pharisees, or the religious leaders. And because of that, verse 16 says, for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Yeshua because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Again, this originated with the religious leaders. Well, in some Bibles, it actually says here, because he was breaking the Sabbath. If you look up the Greek word here, it's actually luo, and it means to loosen. What they said about Yeshua is that he was loosening the Sabbath. You see, it was a question of authority. They're not talking about the Sabbath as we find it in the Torah. They're talking about the Sabbath that was bound by the Pharisees, bound upon the people. And they were angry at Yeshua because they believed that what he had been doing on the Sabbath was loosening the Sabbath. In other words, it was undermining the authority of the Pharisees regarding the Sabbath. And it's really this matter of authority that caused them to persecute him. This is his answer. And his answer to them about this is tantamount to picking up a stick and sticking it in their eye. This absolute and total contempt for these Pharisees and their religious rules in this answer of Yeshua Messiah. He answered them, my Father is working until now, and I myself am working. Well, what about that list? What about that list of all the things you can't do on the Sabbath that defines what work is? What about that? Why did he say, my Father's working, I'm working? There's a poke in their eye. That's exactly what it was. Now, to us, if we look at the details of what work truly is, we're going to find that Yeshua Messiah is exactly right, and those Pharisees are totally wrong. But he didn't take time to explain all that to them. Why? Because he had the authority to demonstrate to them, to Israel, and to all of us what is actually work and what is not work in the sense of the Sabbath. You see, it is true that God created the world in 6 days and then he rested. And this is the model that we are given for the Sabbath. That's what the scripture says. We read that in Exodus. But is that what work means in Exodus? What does the word work actually mean? Is it some list of activities? Is it lighting a fire? The actual act of lighting a fire? Is it perhaps making shoes? How about sewing up a shirt? You know, we can make a list of all these different kind of activities that we think of as work. Is that what the word means? Here's the Hebrew word, melakah. The definition, Strong's definition, is generally employment. Also, property as the result of labor, business. The AHLB agrees with this. Work, business, workmanship, goods, cattle, stuff, things. You see, it's not just things you do. That's not what work is. How could it possibly be? Are you going to stop your heart from beating on Sabbath? How about breathing? Does that work? Eating? What about Sabbath morning when you feel like you need to get up and go to the bathroom? Is that going to be work? Work is not the same as activity. This kind of work, it's not the same as activity. It's employment. It's business. It's doing things for you. For you. Advancing your interests. You've got 6 days to do that. Go out and do it and put everything you've got into it. Whatever business Yahweh has given you to do, whatever employment he's given you to do, get out there for 6 days and go for it. On the Sabbath, that's his day. You have to cease from those activities that are about you. Now, why is it that those Pharisees didn't know that? Why didn't they understand that? Instead, they made this long list of activities you couldn't do? Well, I'll tell you the reason. It's the same reason why when you go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, you have to stand in line for 2 hours. It's bureaucratic thinking. It's a matter of controlling people, controlling what you do. We can't trust people to have a conscience, to know the difference between doing something for Yahweh and doing something for their own selfish interests. So we need to make a list. And you know, if you follow all those lists, if that is how you think about your relationship with Yahweh, you will never know Him. Never. Never. You can't know Him like that. And if you really read this command about the Sabbath in the book of Exodus, it doesn't say anything like what they say that it says. It's not about prohibiting certain activities. It's about prohibiting your works, the works of your flesh, the things that you are doing just for you, your selfish activities. When Yeshua Messiah says about that day that my Father keeps working till now and I keep working, what is he saying? He's talking about his Father's work, his Father's employment. See, that's very different. Now, you should be very glad that the Father has not stopped working. Yeshua said he makes the sun shine on the righteous and the wicked. What if on Sabbath he rested from making the sun shine? Anybody up for that? The whole universe is dependent on him. Of course he keeps working. Every day. He does that for us. He doesn't have to do that. He does that for you and me. So on the Sabbath, he's very busy. In fact, you could look at the Sabbath as his biggest day, because that's where all his people are supposed to be fellowshipping with him, right? So he's very busy that day. He's having communion with all of his people. He set that day aside as the most important day that we regularly are observing. It's a day for fellowship. You know, here in the book of Exodus, it says, first of all, it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. This is something he's given to Israel because we have a special relationship with him. And this is a special gift to Israel. And what is the reason? That you may know that I am Yahweh, who sanctifies you. In other words, who sets you apart, who makes you holy. How is keeping a list of rules going to make you know Yahweh? Is a list of rules really going to bring you into a personal relationship with Yahweh? Now, don't mishear me. I'm not talking about not keeping the commandments. If you're interpreting what I'm saying as not keeping the commandments, you aren't understanding me. Like Yeshua Messiah, I totally believe in keeping the commandments. But what this is about today, what we're discussing, is how do we keep the commandments? You see, that's the question. How do we keep the commandments? What is it really all about? It says, do not profane the Sabbath. What does it mean to profane something? It's to make it common. I just wonder if we have these traditions and we just do the same thing on every Sabbath, and we say the same prayers every single Sabbath until they lose all their meaning, all of their personal meaning to us. I just wonder if that's making them common. Something to think about, isn't it? For Yeshua, what he said Sabbath was about, for him, was doing the works of his Father. My Father's working, I'm working with him. Now, it strikes me that Yahweh is probably doing different things every Shabbat. That's what I've seen. And if Shabbat is about doing the works of our Father on that day, yeah, we're not going to be doing the common things we do every day. We're not going to be at our personal employment, at business, if you will. We're going to be about our Father's business on that day. That's how you keep the Sabbath. But you see, there's one problem with that. You have to actually know what he's doing. That's where a list is a lot easier. If you just have a list of things you can do and not do, if you have a tradition where you go through certain rituals, that's a lot easier, isn't it? Because you don't have to even know your Creator at all to do that. All you really need to do that is you need to know a religion. And you know, there's lots of religions you can choose from that all claim to lead you to God. And they all use religious rituals. Why are they using all of these religious rituals? The answer is simple, because none of them know him. None of them. If you've been going from religion to try to find God, stop that. Stop that. You're not going to find him that way. Those people who are pushing religion, they're doing that because they don't know him. And maybe a lot of them want to know him. I hope they do. But I'm just telling you, if they're practicing religion, they haven't found him. And that's really what Yeshua was trying to show us through all of this. That it's about something real. It's about not profaning the Sabbath, but being a holy, set-apart person. Set apart to who? Doing what he's doing. That's what the Sabbath is all about. Is it rest? Yes. There's nothing more restful. There's nothing more restful than ceasing from your ordinary activities that you normally do and spending that day totally devoted to what Yahweh is doing. Let's talk about this man who was afflicted. Was that day restful for him? Do you think it was work for him to pick up his bed and tromp all around Jerusalem so everybody could see him? Or was it glorifying Yahweh? Was it doing what Yahweh was doing that day? You see what I'm saying to you? Do you think Yahweh would really be offended because that man was obeying Yeshua Messiah that day, carrying his bed all around Jerusalem so everybody could see the miracle that had been done in his life? Friends, we have to open up our mind and, more importantly, open up our heart to who our Father and his self-sacrificing Son really are, and what it is that they've been trying to tell us from the book of Genesis forward, and what it is that they truly long for in their sons and daughters. Yeshua Messiah is telling us how to keep the Sabbath here. But in that, he's telling us how to step up to a higher level, and that it's really more than just being about religious rules. That it really is about our relationship with our Father and joining with him in precious fellowship and doing what he is doing. That's the example that we have from Yeshua Messiah. He was not breaking the Sabbath that day, as some translations say, as some Christian groups even say. But he was loosing the Sabbath. He was loosing it from religious control. He was just opening that up so that the people of Israel could observe and they could see that our Father in heaven cannot be bound by some magic religious authority. That he is above and beyond that. And if he chooses on the Sabbath day or any other day to express his grace and his mercy on some poor afflicted person, he is not bound. But he can do that, and even more so, we can join with him in doing that. Now, there's another aspect of all of this that I think is rather interesting, rather amazing. And I taught on this portion of Scripture last Shabbat. And that night, after I had taught on it, Yahweh spoke to me and showed me something else about this man. You notice that this man had been ill for 38 years. Have you ever heard the number 38 before? The book of Numbers in the Bible, Bamidbar in the Torah, covers a period of 38 years of Israel in the wilderness. It tells us the story there of a people who had a glorious future ahead of them, a glorious purpose to enter into their own land after years and years in slavery, to be elevated up to a position as part of Yahweh's nation above every other nation in the world. All they had to do was go in and take it. That happened within 2 years of their leaving Egypt. Yahweh was taking them from Egypt into the promised land. And why not? That was the whole purpose, wasn't it? But you know what happened? They sinned. They committed the sin of unbelief. And they failed. And because of that, they were afflicted. And that generation of Israel was just like that man who was languishing away by the pool of Bethsaida. They had no help. Oh, yes, Yahweh helped them. He showed them mercy. But so far as their condition of wandering in the wilderness, that affliction, there was nothing that could stop that. They were languishing for 38 years. And at the end of that time, the word of Yahweh spoke to them and said, "Get up." And the new generation of Israel and those few who had been faithful of the old generation of Israel got up. And they picked up their bed, which is a picture of where you live. Where your bed is where you live. They picked up their bed and they walked. They walked into the promised land. And they were well. It seems that what happened here was a picture. What Yahweh did with this man was a picture. Before the very eyes of these Pharisees and the people of Israel, of themselves, and they could not even see it. They themselves did not have enough compassion to care about what their own condition had been in the wilderness. Think about it. How about you? Do you see it? Do you understand that message? Here we are in the last days. And the remnant is like that man. We are the afflicted of this world, scattered to every corner of the earth. The remnant has no friend in this world. Yeshua Messiah is speaking to you. Get up, pick up your bed, and walk. Where are we walking? We're walking home. We must get ready. The time will be soon. The ancient Pharisaical authorities argued over this in great detail. And they concluded that since these verses tie work to the creation, to Yahweh's creation of the world, that work must relate then to creative activity. And further, they specified 39 creative activities, really 39 different groups of activities, which they then subcategorized with many detailed activities beyond that. And all of this is contained in the Mishnah. So for them, if you disobeyed any of those laws regarding the 39 creative activities, then you were breaking the Sabbath because you were working on the Sabbath. And this general idea continues in Orthodox Judaism today, but it originated among the Pharisees. What happened next is that once this was decided, this was bound upon Shabbat Shalom, and welcome everyone. Today we have a message for you from Yeshua Messiah to help us all to understand how to keep the Sabbath. There's a lot of argument about the Sabbath. There are different groups that keep the Sabbath different ways. And even in ancient times, there were arguments about the Sabbath. Among all sorts of Jewish people, there are different ideas about the Sabbath. Among Messianic people, Christian people. And so today we want to talk about how you keep the Sabbath. Now, just to give you an example of what we're dealing with here, we have the Sabbath law in the book of Exodus. Let me read it to you. Exodus 31:12 through 17. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak also to the sons of Israel, saying, Most certainly you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. You shall keep the authority." In other words, once they said it, it magically became true. The very fact that they said it made it true. We have to understand this aspect of the Sabbath and what Yeshua Messiah was actually dealing with to understand how he treated the Sabbath. And we're going to look today at a very, very interesting case of how he dealt with the Sabbath, which is actually meant to be an instruction, not only to the Pharisees of his day, but even to us as to how the Sabbath should actually be kept. Here in John, Yohanan, chapter 5, it says this. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Because of the chronology of the gospel story here, it's generally believed that this particular feast was the Passover feast. 3 times a year, all the men were commanded, Jewish people. Now, this comes under the category of binding and loosing. And the Pharisees had the authority, or claimed the authority, of binding and loosing. The Jewish Encyclopedia explains more to us about binding and loosing. It says, binding and loosing, rabbinical term for forbidding and permitting. The power of binding and loosing was always claimed by the Pharisees. Under Queen Alexandra, the Pharisees, says Josephus, quote, became the administrators of all public affairs so as to be empowered to banish and readmit whom they pleased, as well as to loose and to bind. End of the quote from Josephus, but continuing now the quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. This does not mean that, as the learned men, they merely decided what, according to the law, was forbidden or allowed. but that they possessed and exercised the power of tying or untying a thing by the spell of their divine Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work therein, that soul should be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Well, the controversy in the Jewish world over how you keep the Sabbath all relates to the word here, work. Because anyone who works on the Sabbath will be cut off from his people. What is work? Well,